The moment my 100-year-old oak tree hit the ground, I thought the worst was over. But then, everything shifted. The earth trembled again, and the entire neighborhood froze as that fallen giant rolled, twisted, and crushed the sheriff's house like it was made of paper. Within minutes, the HOA panicked, neighbors whispered, and Karen, the one who forced them to cut my tree, went ghost white. But the real shock didn't come from the damage. It came from what the sheriff found buried under his home, hidden for decades, and worth destroying an entire neighborhood to keep secret. Before I tell you how this nightmare spiraled into accusations, investigations, and the HOA begging me for mercy, make sure you subscribe, because stories like this deserve to be heard wherever justice, karma, and truth finally collide. The morning began with the kind of quiet that only old neighborhoods know, the soft hum of distant sprinklers, the rustle of leaves swaying against sunlight, and the deep, comforting presence of my 100-year-old oak tree standing tall beside my driveway. For years, that tree had been more than a landmark. It was the heart of my property. Its branches shaded the porch every summer and dropped golden leaves every fall, creating a carpet that felt like living history beneath my feet. But on this particular morning, the peace felt fragile. There was something odd in the air, a heaviness I couldn't place. And the moment I stepped outside, I found the reason. At the end of my driveway stood Karen, arms folded, chin raised, eyes sharp with the kind of entitlement that could sour the day of anyone within a 5-mile radius. She stood beside 2 HOA board members, whispering to them while pointing repeatedly at my oak tree as if she had discovered a crime scene. I didn't approach them immediately. Instead, I took a moment to observe the scene. The board president, a man who had built his authority on threats and passive-aggressive letters, kept nodding at every word Karen spat. The other member clutched a clipboard, scribbling notes as though documenting an environmental disaster. I felt a long, cold twist of dread roll up my spine. That oak tree had stood longer than any of us. It had survived storms, droughts, and decades of homeowners. But now, somehow, it had become a target. By the time I walked down the driveway, Karen was already raising her voice. Even the quiet morning air couldn't soften it. She claimed the tree posed a hazard, that its roots extended too far, that it blocked the sidewalk, none of which were true. In fact, the sidewalk curved intentionally around the trunk, a design choice approved long before any of the current HOA members even lived here. But HOA logic doesn't operate on facts. It operates on control. And Karen, above all, craved control. When she noticed me approaching, she tightened her grip on her purse strap and took a sharp breath, as if preparing to deliver the performance of a lifetime. She waved a stack of papers and explained, without a hint of hesitation, that she had already filed a complaint with the county. According to her, the tree needed to be removed immediately for public safety. Her tone dripped with forced sincerity, as though she truly believed she was saving the community. But beneath that false concern, I saw something else. Resentment. Bitterness. A personal vendetta she had never quite admitted out loud. She hated that my property looked better than hers, that my yard remained the most admired on the street, and that my oak tree stood taller, prouder, and more beautiful than anything in her barren front lawn. She once called it an eyesore of arrogance. I never understood what that meant until now. By noon, the HOA had delivered an official notice demanding I remove the tree at my expense. I appealed the decision, of course, but the board dismissed the appeal within hours. They didn't even pretend to follow proper procedure. Karen had spoken, and they were determined to obey. The next day, I awoke to the growling sound of engines outside my window. When I stepped out onto the porch, my heart sank. A commercial tree removal crew had already parked their trucks in front of my driveway. Their chainsaws gleamed in the morning light. A crane loomed overhead, poised like a metal predator. Karen stood proudly beside the workers, acting as though she herself had hired them. I protested, waving the legal paperwork I still possessed. But Karen had anticipated everything. She paraded a forged emergency clearance document, One she claimed came from the sheriff's department, though the signature looked nothing like his. The workers, confused but eager to avoid confrontation, deferred to the HOA's so-called authority. I stood helpless as the first chainsaw sliced into the bark. The sound pierced the neighborhood like a scream. Chips of wood flew as sawdust filled the air. Each cut felt like a punch to the chest. That tree had held memories in its branches. Childhood afternoons spent climbing. Quiet evenings beneath its shade. Stormy nights where the wind howled through its leaves like nature's own symphony. And now, Karen watched with a smugness that made the moment even more brutal. By the time the trunk gave way, the neighborhood stood silent. The ground shook as the oak crashed into the street, collapsing with the final thundering groan of a century-old life, brought to a sudden end. But the fall wasn't clean. The crew misjudged the angle. The oak slid, twisted, then rolled, its massive weight dragging it across the pavement. The world seemed to freeze as the tree barreled toward the sheriff's house. No one moved. No one breathed. It smashed into his porch with a force that sent dust flying into the sky. Wood splintered. Windows shattered. The roof caved in as if crushed by fate itself. Karen's face drained of color. The HOA board stumbled backward. The workers stood frozen, horrified. And in that moment, everything changed. The sheriff's door swung open. His silhouette appeared against the broken frame. And he wasn't alone. The sheriff stepped into the open doorway as dust drifted through the fractured beams behind him. Sunlight cut through the haze, outlining his figure in a pale, eerie glow. The porch beneath his boots groaned under the pressure of the fallen oak, now wedged across the entire front of the house. Every eye in the neighborhood seemed locked on him, waiting for his reaction, not because his home had been destroyed, but because everyone silently feared the wrath that might follow. His expression wasn't anger. It was shock. The kind that runs deeper than words, making a person completely still. He surveyed the crushed entryway, the shattered windows, the dislodged roof. What had once been the safest home on the street now looked like a disaster zone. Behind him, his wife stood at his shoulder, her face pale with disbelief. Her hand gripped the doorframe as though steadying herself from the weight of the moment. The tree removal crew backed away instinctively. Their machines idled, flickering amber lights bouncing off the scattered debris. One worker muttered something under his breath as he stared at the damage, while Karen remained perfectly still, frozen in a rigidity that looked nothing like composure. It was fear, real fear, quiet yet unmistakable. The sheriff took a slow step forward, boots pressing into crushed boards. He surveyed the fallen oak, then shifted his gaze to the street. He traced the path the trunk had taken, from my property, down the driveway, across the pavement, straight into his house. The trajectory told a story all on its own, one written not by nature but by human arrogance. It didn't take much to understand that the fall had been preventable. This wasn't an act of God, it was an act of reckless interference. He stepped fully onto what remained of his porch, then walked around the splintered trunk. As he moved, the neighborhood held its breath. His attention lingered on the workers' trucks, on the crane that had misjudged the tree's angle, and finally, inevitably, on the HOA members standing behind him. Karen's arms clung to her purse strap with desperate tension. The clipboard holder shuffled awkwardly. The president couldn't even meet the sheriff's eyes. The tension built until it felt impossible to breathe. My oak tree had been reduced to rubble within minutes, yet its final act had carved an irreversible fault line through the community. As the sheriff examined the forged paperwork Karen had submitted, papers she still clutched but no longer dared to wave, his shock hardened into something heavier. Not fury, not yet, but realization. He tapped the corner of the document with a slow, deliberate motion. The silence that followed tightened around every one of us. His wife stepped beside him, her eyes scanning the damage as if trying to piece together what had happened. She glanced from the fallen oak to me, then back to Karen, who remained stiff as stone. Everyone knew she had orchestrated the entire event. She had demanded the HOA force the removal. She had insisted it was a threat. She had manipulated the process, pushing her claims through without proper inspection or approval. And she had allowed a forged clearance letter to be used to justify destroying property she wanted gone. The sheriff placed the forged paper gently on the stump of a broken beam. He didn't need words. That single gesture was enough. The workers exchanged glances. The HOA members shuffled their feet. Even birds perched on telephone lines seemed unsettled by the weight of the morning. In the aftermath, the crew moved slowly. They began stabilizing the fallen trunk, shifting heavy branches away from the damaged home. Each scrape of wood against concrete echoed across the street. The sheriff's wife retreated inside briefly, returning with her phone. She walked with purpose, documenting the destruction from every angle, capturing images of the crushed siding, the splintered railings, the gaping hole where their living room window had been. As she recorded the scene, the HOA president attempted to speak, but nerves tangled his words into nothing. Karen, meanwhile, maintained her rigid posture. Her expression flickered unpredictably, fear, denial, anger, then back to fear again. She appeared to search for a narrative to shift blame, but there was none to be found. The tree lay where it lay. The damage was undeniable. Standing at the edge of the driveway, I felt a conflicting mix of emotions. Sorrow for the tree I had lost. Shock at the destruction it had caused. Relief that justice had taken a shape no one expected. And above all, a simmering determination that had begun to grow deep within me. This wasn't just about a tree. It was about power, and the way people like Karen abused it until reality finally pushed back. As the workers continued clearing the debris, the sheriff pulled out a small notebook and began documenting details with sharp precision. He sketched the tree's fall path, measured distances with deliberate care, and photographed the forged clearance letter. His attention then returned to the HOA board, who looked increasingly uncomfortable beneath his steady gaze. Neighbors stepped outside their homes to observe, whispering among themselves. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others looked toward me with sympathy, silently acknowledging the injustice that had escalated beyond anyone's control. A few recorded the scene themselves, perhaps sensing that this moment was larger than a dispute. It was the breaking point of something long overdue. An hour passed before the sheriff finally spoke. His voice was calm but carried a weight that silenced the entire street. Though I couldn't hear every word, the tone made everything clear. This wasn't over. This wasn't something the HOA could sweep away with a fine or a letter. His expression, the precision of his notes, the photographs of the forged document, all pointed toward a storm coming for the people responsible. And for the first time, Karen seemed to understand just how deeply she had entangled herself in consequences she could no longer manipulate. But it wasn't until his wife stepped forward, her voice steady and purposeful, that the full gravity of the situation became undeniable. She held up her phone, displaying something to her husband, a piece of information that froze him in place. Something she had captured inside the house. The sheriff's eyes widened, not with fear, but with unmistakable resolve. Whatever she showed him, it changed everything. And when he turned toward Karen, the look in his eyes made every last person on the street realize. The real fight was only beginning. What the sheriff's wife revealed on her phone changed the entire atmosphere of the neighborhood. The shift was immediate and undeniable, like a storm cloud rolling across the sun. She held the screen firmly, her expression composed but resolute, as though the evidence she carried was both a burden and a weapon. The sheriff studied it with growing intensity, the dust on his boots settling as he stood completely still. For a long moment the world around him paused. Workers froze mid-task. HOA members stood rigid. Even Karen, usually unable to resist the urge to speak, remained silent, watching him with a nervous twitch in her jaw. Whatever appeared on that screen had drawn a line in the sand, and all of us felt it. Slowly, the sheriff lowered the phone and handed it back to his wife. His posture had changed, shoulders squared, jaw tightened, breath steady in a way that signaled composure born from experience. He surveyed the wreckage once more, but this time, his attention narrowed to details only he seemed able to interpret. His eyes moved from the crushed entryway to the heavy limbs scattered across the porch, then to the gouges in the siding where branches had torn through. But underlying it all was something more. Something that made his reaction different from mere shock or frustration. He walked toward the street, each step measured. Everyone instinctively stepped back. The workers shifted uneasily. The HOA president swallowed hard. Karen tried to hold her posture, but her shoulders tightened, and her fingers trembled above her purse strap. She had been losing control since the moment the tree fell, but now she seemed aware that she had triggered something irreversible. The sheriff reached the sidewalk and stopped in front of the tree removal crew. His gaze held no anger, only clarity, the kind that emerges after truth replaces confusion. He examined the machinery, the placement of the crane, the angle of the cut on the oak's trunk. He took in every technical detail with the precision of someone who had spent years piecing together evidence from broken scenes. He made notes again. Slow, deliberate lines across paper. His wife stood a few feet behind him, documenting the process with quiet steadiness. The workers whispered among themselves, sensing the shift. One of them stepped forward as if to explain, then stopped when the sheriff's posture indicated he wasn't ready to hear anything yet. Meanwhile, I stood near my driveway, absorbing the moment. Grief for my oak tree still pulsed through me, but now it mingled with something else, vindication. For months, I had endured letters, fines, accusations, and complaints engineered by Karen and supported by her loyal board. Every attempt to reason had been dismissed. Every appeal had been suppressed. And now, because of Karen's relentless obsession, the consequences had escalated beyond their control. The sheriff turned his attention away from the equipment and shifted toward the HOA board. The president tried to steady himself, straightening his clipboard, but his hands betrayed his nerves. The other board member looked ready to melt into the pavement. And then there was Karen, silent, pale, and determined to pretend she still held even a shred of authority. He approached her slowly. She attempted a smile, but it faltered instantly. The sheriff stopped just short of her space and observed her with a neutrality that felt heavier than anger. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse her. Instead, he held out his notebook and tapped the corner of the forged document she had provided earlier. Karen flinched. Her shoulders collapsed inward for the briefest moment before she forced them upright again. Anyone else might have missed it, but every witness here noticed. It was the first visible crack in her facade. The sheriff didn't speak. He didn't have to. His silence carried the full weight of what he now knew. His wife stepped forward, lifting her phone again. This time, she angled the screen just enough that I caught a glimpse, a video clip of the moment the tree crashed into the house. But it wasn't the impact he focused on, it was everything that happened immediately before. Dust swirling inside the living room. A ceiling that had already begun sagging. A line of fractures spreading across the interior wall. And the lights, flickering in an unnatural pattern that suggested more than simple structural damage. This wasn't just a fallen tree. Something inside the sheriff's home had already been compromised. He turned and walked toward the house again, navigating the debris as though retracing a critical timeline. He leaned down to examine a section of fractured flooring, then looked up toward the exposed beams overhead. His breath steadied, as it had earlier, but now it carried the unmistakable tension of realization. The sheriff's wife joined him inside. Through the broken walls, I watched her point toward the far side of the living room where dust still floated in the air. He crouched, touching the fractured support beam, examining the crack running through it like a scar. Layers of dust and splinters surrounded the area, revealing a pattern that did not match the direction of the tree's fall. Something had weakened the structure before the tree even hit. He stood again and stepped outside, calling for the workers to stop moving any more debris. His command was calm but firm, and the machinery immediately quieted. The sudden silence spread across the neighborhood like a tremor. He returned to the HOA board. This time, there was no mistaking the shift in his demeanor. His voice remained steady, but there was purpose in every movement. He pointed toward the crushed porch, then toward the interior of the house. He showed them a photograph on his phone, something captured by his wife, a detail so alarming that even the HOA president's breath caught in his throat. Again, I couldn't hear every word, but the meaning became clear through the reaction alone. The HOA board hadn't just been negligent. They had approved the removal of a massive tree without proper permits, using forged authorization, and their actions had indirectly damaged the sheriff's home long before the oak struck it. He stepped back from them and closed his notebook. The board members' faces had gone from pale to ashen. Karen's posture finally broke entirely. Her shoulders fell, her confidence vanished, and her gaze darted between the sheriff and the ruined home. But the sheriff wasn't finished. He turned toward me. For the first time that day, his expression softened into something that wasn't shock or frustration. It was determination. He walked toward my driveway, stopping at the remains of the oak stump. And then, with the entire neighborhood watching, he said something that froze every last homeowner in place, not with fear, but with the promise of something far more powerful. He said he wanted to show me what they had found inside his house. The sheriff led me toward the fractured entrance of his home with a steadiness that suggested he had already accepted the gravity of what lay inside. The oak tree's massive trunk still pressed against the broken porch, but there was just enough space to navigate around it. Dust drifted through the sunlight in shimmering currents, and each step we took echoed across the damaged wood. The closer we came to the opening, the more the destruction revealed itself: splintered beams, collapsed framing, and a jagged wound carved into the structure. But beneath the visible destruction lay something deeper, something that tugged uneasily at the air. Inside, the living room looked frozen mid-collapse. Furniture sat at odd angles where the floor had shifted. The once stable beams that held the room together now hung fractured and twisted, as though weakened long before the oak ever fell. The sheriff's wife stood near the far wall, her phone still in hand, illuminating a series of cracks running horizontally across the plaster, cracks too deliberate to be caused by a falling tree. The sheriff motioned for me to follow. His voice remained calm, yet every gesture carried purpose. He pointed toward the ceiling where a section of drywall sagged unnaturally, revealing insulation pulled loose from pressure that had come from within, not above. The deeper we moved into the space, the clearer the story became. This home had been compromised before the oak ever touched it. He guided me to the center of the room where dust coated the floor like powdered stone. The sheriff crouched and ran his fingers along a long fracture snaking across the boards. The pattern was unmistakable, stress fractures originating from the far corner of the living room, spreading like veins toward the point of impact. The oak had struck with tremendous force, yes, but the underlying weakness had prepared the house to collapse more dramatically than expected. As he examined the fracture, the sheriff's wife played the video again. The clip captured moments before the tree hit, from a camera inside their home. The footage showed the ceiling trembling, dust falling in small bursts, lights flickering sporadically. The house was already reacting to something unseen. The sheriff paused the video and zoomed toward the source of dust just before the impact. It wasn't falling from where the tree would strike. It was drifting from the opposite side of the room. Something had damaged the structure internally. He looked at me with the quiet intensity of someone who had investigated countless incidents and learned to trust patterns more than assumptions. He led me toward the far end of the living room where the cracks were thickest. The wall here bore deeper scars, splits running vertically, the edges faintly darkened as if recently disturbed. He tapped gently on the plaster. A hollow sound responded, too thin for a load-bearing wall. He tapped again farther right. This time, the sound shifted, a different pitch, softer and more concealed. He nodded toward his wife, who shone her phone light along the crack lines. The sheriff pressed his palm against the wall. Then, with slow, deliberate pressure, he pushed. The plaster sagged inward before settling back again. A faint puff of dust escaped from the seam. Whatever was behind that wall was not part of the original structure. He stepped back and surveyed the entire room again. The mismatched patterns, the odd angles of the fractures, the timeline of dust in the video, all of it painted a picture that didn't make sense at first glance but became clearer the longer we studied it. He motioned for me to follow him outside once more. The air felt heavier as we stepped around the debris and returned to the open street. Karen and the HOA board still stood rigid under the weight of the sheriff's scrutiny. Neighbors watched in uneasy silence, feeling the shift but not understanding its cause. The sheriff walked past the board members, his expression controlled but firm. He paused in front of his home again and then looked toward the boundary between his property and the common area maintained by the HOA. His wife joined him, pointing toward a strip of ground where the soil looked disturbed, loose, uneven, and freshly compacted. He traced a line from that disturbed section of ground toward the area beneath the living room. His notebook returned to his hand as he sketched a path, his pencil strokes heavy with certainty. I felt my breath catch as the realization slowly took shape. Something had been done under the house. He walked toward the disturbed ground, knelt, and sifted the soil through his fingers. The texture was inconsistent, freshly overturned in some areas, compressed in others, as though tools had passed through recently. A faint indentation carved a subtle pathway leading directly beneath the living room's foundation. He stood and motioned for me to step closer. When I looked down, the truth sharpened with unsettling clarity. The outline resembled a narrow trench, recently filled and hastily concealed. The sheriff paced the length of it, counting his steps, then returned to the entrance of his home. His wife showed me another photograph she had taken earlier that morning. Deep within the fractured flooring inside the living room, a subtle gap had opened near the baseboards. Through that gap, she had captured something the workers hadn't noticed. Soil. Loose, disturbed, unmistakably fresh soil inside the house. The sheriff straightened, connecting each detail with practiced precision. His tone remained steady, but the weight behind his words was undeniable. He didn't need to raise his voice to express what the evidence already said. Someone had been digging beneath the house. Not recently. Not accidentally. Systematically. He turned toward the HOA board again. Their breaths came shallow. Karen's face drained of all remaining color. She clutched her purse as though trying to stabilize herself against the truth forming in front of her. The sheriff's investigation had uncovered something far beyond the fall of a tree. And suddenly, the forged permit, the rushed removal, Karen's obsession, and the HOA's urgency took on an entirely different meaning. He walked back to the disturbed soil, then looked directly at me. He said the weakness in the house didn't start today. It started underground. And the last piece of the puzzle, the one that would explain everything, was buried beneath the living room floor. His voice remained calm as he said he needed to confirm one more thing. Then he signaled for the workers to bring him a flashlight and a crowbar. He was going to open the floor. Right now. The workers approached with a crowbar and flashlight, handing them to the sheriff with quiet, uneasy movements. Their machinery sat silent behind us, engines cooling, warning lights reflecting off the scattered debris of the fallen oak. The entire neighborhood watched as the sheriff stepped back into the fractured entrance of his home, the crowbar in one hand, the flashlight in the other. His posture, steady and unshaken, carried the weight of someone who had uncovered far more than structural damage. He entered the living room slowly, surveying the sagging ceiling and the cracked walls once more before kneeling beside the fractured floorboards. Dust swirled in the air as he placed the flashlight on the ground, angling it toward the gap where his wife had photographed the loose soil. The beam illuminated the fissure, its edges slightly lifted as though the boards were struggling to conceal something beneath. With a deliberate motion, He wedged the crowbar between the seams. A sharp groan echoed through the damaged house as the board resisted, then finally lifted with a crack. Dust burst from the opening, filling the air like a pale cloud. He set the first board aside and moved to the next, prying it loose with equal care. More dust escaped, accompanied by the unmistakable scent of freshly disturbed earth, a scent so out of place inside a living room that it drew every observer closer to the threshold. One by one, the boards came up. A rectangular section of flooring slowly transformed into a shallow pit filled with loose, uneven soil. The sheriff brushed his glove across the surface, revealing the faint outline of narrow groove. They weren't natural. They weren't random. They were tool marks, small, jagged, repeated, and unmistakably deliberate. Someone had dug here. He swept the light slowly across the pit. The soil rose and fell in uneven layers, as though someone had tunneled beneath the house, removed dirt, then attempted to cover their tracks before the disaster this morning exposed everything. The sheriff studied the grooves carefully, tracing them with his fingertip. The pattern was shallow but distinct. It suggested effort, persistence, and a misguided purpose. His wife stepped beside him, her breath steady but taut as she recorded the scene for evidence. She adjusted the flashlight, focusing the beam deeper into the pit. The light revealed something even more unsettling, a narrow cavity extending horizontally beneath the foundation. The tunnel ran directly toward the land maintained by the HOA, toward the section of disturbed soil he had identified outside. A chill rippled through the room. The sheriff leaned closer, examining the cavity. The soil at the entrance appeared compacted from crawling or dragging. The ceiling of the tunnel sagged in multiple places, fractured by weight it wasn't built to hold. The damage inside the house, the cracks, the shifted beams, the trembling ceiling, suddenly made perfect sense. The tunnel had weakened the structural integrity of the home long before the tree had ever fallen. The sheriff straightened slowly, the truth settling over him in a heavy, undeniable wave. This wasn't an accident. This was sabotage. But the question remained, why? He walked outside again, the crowbar still in hand. His boots carried traces of soil that didn't belong above ground. As he stepped into the sunlight, the neighborhood watched him more intently than ever. The HOA board stood frozen, their faces drained of color, their composure shattered by the unfolding revelation. Karen looked as if she'd aged a decade in minute. Her arms hung stiff at her sides. Her breath faltered in sharp, uneven bursts. She no longer attempted to project control. Her mask had cracked too deeply to repair. The sheriff approached the disturbed ground near the property line. He knelt again, inspecting the soil with new understanding. The trench-like indentation now aligned perfectly with the cavity. Beneath the house. He motioned for one of the workers to bring him a probing rod, a long metal tool often used for underground mapping. The worker complied, handing it to him without hesitation. The sheriff inserted the rod into the disturbed soil. It descended far deeper than it should have. He probed farther along the ground, again, the rod sank with unnatural ease. He moved in a straight line toward his house, tracing the exact path of the hidden tunnel. Every test confirmed the same thing. A man-made tunnel had been dug from the HOA common area beneath the sheriff's home. The realization spread subtly across the neighborhood like a whisper of dread. People stepped closer to the street, craning their necks to see what was happening. Conversations fell silent. Even the breeze seemed to pause. The sheriff stood, dusting soil from his gloves. His posture shifted, no longer merely investigative, but resolute. He turned toward the HOA board, and his eyes carried the kind of stillness that precedes decisive action. The board president opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He looked shattered, unable to escape the weight of the unfolding truth. The clipboard he clutched felt suddenly useless in his hands. The other board members stared at the ground, trembling slightly. Karen stood alone. Her shadow quivered on the pavement. Her composure vanished entirely the moment the sheriff walked toward her. She took a step back, her breath sharp, her eyes darting to the faces of neighbors who now saw her differently, not as an overbearing rule enforcer, but as someone entangled in something far darker than petty HOA disputes. The sheriff stopped in front of her, leaving only a few feet of quiet air between them. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse her. He simply asked, calmly, directly, why there had been digging beneath his home. Karen blinked rapidly. Her mouth opened, then closed again. The sunlight reflected in her eyes, revealing the panic she could no longer mask. She shook her head in denial, but the gesture lacked conviction. Her hands trembled visibly. The more she tried to compose herself, the more her facade crumbled. For the first time, her reaction wasn't defensive arrogance. It was fear. The sheriff didn't press further. His silence was enough. He turned away from her and addressed the crowd, announcing that he needed to conduct a deeper inspection before determining the full extent of the structural compromise. His voice carried strength, not anger, but determined pursuit of truth. He walked back into the house. His wife followed. The workers prepared additional equipment, and as I approached the doorway, the sheriff motioned for me to join him again. He pointed toward the tunnel beneath his home. He said the digging wasn't random. Someone had been trying to reach something, and until he uncovered what that was, none of us would understand the full motive behind this sabotage. He raised the flashlight, illuminating the tunnel's dark throat. Then he stepped inside. The sheriff lowered himself into the narrow opening beneath the living room floor with the precision of someone accustomed to moving through dangerous spaces. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating a cramped tunnel carved crudely into the earth. The air down there felt dense, untouched, and unnervingly cold. The sheriff's wife held the light steady from above, her breath shallow, as if the tunnel itself exhaled a warning. I followed as carefully as I could, crouching low beneath the sagging floor joists. Dirt brushed my shoulders. The scent of damp earth and disturbed soil filled the air. The tunnel stretched forward, tight walls curving slightly as though the person digging had no map, only determination. Its crude shape left little room to move, and the silence surrounding us grew heavier with each step deeper underground. The sheriff moved slowly, analyzing every angle of the dirt, every crack where weight had pressed against the fragile space. The deeper we went, the more apparent it became. This tunnel wasn't new. It had been worked on over weeks, perhaps months. Thin layers of compacted soil showed where dirt had been removed bit by bit. Every scrape mark, every uneven groove told a story of someone desperate to reach beneath the house. But why here? Why this home? The tunnel sloped slightly downward as we approached its far end. There, the air thickened. The sheriff paused and swept his light across a wider chamber carved beneath the foundation, an unsettling pocket of empty space, just large enough to kneel in. The loosened soil in the center had been burrowed deeply, forming a pit with sides smoothed by repeated digging. And at the bottom of that pit, something metallic glinted. My breath caught. The sheriff descended into the chamber and brushed the dirt aside, revealing the object. It was a rusted metal box, weathered by time and soil, its corners dented but intact. The flashlight's glow traced the faded outline of county markings belonging to old property survey archives. This wasn't just a random container. This was history. The sheriff lifted the box carefully, its weight significant enough to suggest it contained more than papers. Dirt fell away as he placed it on a stable patch of soil and worked to pry it open. The rusty hinges resisted at first, groaning under his force, but finally gave way. Inside lay bundles of documents, preserved remarkably well despite decades underground. Maps, land deeds, boundary records, and handwritten survey notes, all sealed in protective sleeve. Papers that belonged to properties predating the HOA by at least 50 years. Real estate that had once extended far beyond its current borders. The sheriff flipped through the document. The more he uncovered, the clearer the truth became. This box held original land ownership map. And they revealed something devastating. Large portions of land currently managed and claimed, by the HOA had never legally belonged to them at all. The official boundaries were drawn incorrectly. The HOA had been operating on false borders for years, asserting authority over areas they did not own, including the sheriff's property, including parts of mine, including the very common area where the tunnel originated. Karen's motives sharpened into a chilling clarity. She hadn't been trying to destroy the sheriff's home. She'd been trying to find this box. The sheriff exhaled a deep, steady breath of realization. He scanned the chamber again. The pit had scratch marks along the edges, someone digging frantically, searching for something buried far deeper than they anticipated. When the tunnel weakened the sheriff's home, they must have stopped and panicked. And when the oak tree incident happened, the collapse finally exposed the internal damage. The real intention had not been sabotage. It had been desperation. The sheriff collected the maps and deeds carefully, sealing them in a folder before ascending back through the tunnel. I followed close behind, the weight of the discovery pressing on my thoughts with every step. By the time we emerged into the fractured living room, the workers and neighbors had gathered anxiously, sensing something enormous had been uncovered. The sheriff stepped into the sunlight with the folder in hand. Karen's eyes widened, not with confusion, but recognition. The moment she saw the faded seal on the documents, her body stiffened. Her breath hitched. The truth had found her before any accusation was spoken. A safe the exact size of the hollow beneath the sheriff's house. The sheriff stepped forward. His wife steadied the box of documents. The air grew heavy with tension, the kind that hovers before a storm breaks. Karen's car door opened slowly. She stepped out, shaking, clutching the safe against her chest as though protecting something sacred or incriminating. Her expression crumbled, not with arrogance but with exhaustion, fear, and something like resignation. The sheriff walked toward her, quiet and controlled. She held the safe tighter, knuckles pale, as if this object explained every action she had taken. The forged documents, the obsession with the oak tree, the secret digging, the desperate need for control. But before the sheriff could reach her, Karen spoke. Not loudly, not in anger, but with a voice hollowed by guilt. She said the safe didn't belong to her. She said she'd only been trying to protect the neighborhood. She said something had been buried here long before any of us arrived, something the original landowner had warned about in letters that the HOA had secretly destroyed. The sheriff asked her what was inside the safe. Karen looked down at it, her hands trembling so violently she nearly dropped it. She whispered that she was afraid to open it. And for the first time since I'd known her, Karen cried. The sheriff took the safe gently from her hands. He carried it toward the center of the ruined street. The whole neighborhood watched. And then, slowly, carefully, he turned the dial.